The heat shimmer rose from Interstate 40 like ghosts dancing on black asphalt. And Jake Morrison had been driving through this hellish Arizona stretch for 6 hours straight without seeing another soul, his 18-wheeler's air conditioning having died somewhere outside Flagstaff, leaving him with nothing but the desert wind whipping through his open windows and the radio crackling with distant static that occasionally resolved into snippets of talk shows or country music before dissolving back into white noise. The thermometer on his dashboard read 127 degrees, which couldn't be right, but the way the steering wheel burned his palms and the metal buckle of his seatbelt had branded a mark on his chest when he'd leaned forward suggested maybe it was closer to accurate than he wanted to believe. His CB radio had been silent for hours, which was unusual for this route. Normally there'd be chatter from other drivers, warnings about speed traps or construction, but tonight there was nothing, just the endless hum of his engine and the whisper of superheated air rushing past his cab. The sun had set an hour ago, but the temperature hadn't dropped a degree, and now the darkness beyond his headlights seemed to pulse with residual heat, creating shapes that weren't quite there, mirages of movement that made him grip the wheel tighter and wonder if dehydration was starting to mess with his head. He'd been making this run between Phoenix and Albuquerque for 12 years, knew every mile marker and rest stop by heart, but something felt different tonight, wrong in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the oppressive heat. The exit signs he passed seemed unfamiliar, showing towns he'd never heard of, Perdition Valley, Devil's Throat, Salamander Springs, names that couldn't be real, but there they were, illuminated in his headlights for just long enough to read before disappearing into the darkness behind him. When he reached for his water bottle, he found it empty, though he could have sworn it was half full an hour ago, and his mouth felt like he'd been chewing sand, his tongue swollen and sticky. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a black ribbon cutting through landscape that looked increasingly alien, with rock formations that seemed to lean inward like they were watching him pass, and cacti that stood in perfect rows like an army of thorned sentinels. His GPS had stopped working somewhere around mile marker 187, the screen showing nothing but a blue dot floating in gray void, and when he tried to tune the radio to a weather station, all he got was a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, which was impossible since he'd been driving for hours without stopping. But when he tapped the glass face, the needle didn't move, frozen in place like everything else on this stretch of highway that time seemed to have forgotten. That's when he saw the hitchhiker standing beside the road about a mile ahead, a figure in what looked like a long coat despite the brutal heat, thumb extended toward the traffic that consisted of nothing but Jake's truck on this godforsaken stretch of asphalt. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman, tall and gaunt, with long black hair that hung straight down despite the wind, and she was wearing what looked like a winter coat that went down to her ankles, dark fabric that seemed to absorb his headlights rather than reflect them. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to not stop for anyone on a night like this in the middle of nowhere, but something about her stillness, the way she stood perfectly motionless with her thumb out, made him ease off the accelerator and start pumping the brakes. She didn't move as he approached, didn't turn her head or acknowledge his truck in any way, just stood there like a statue with her arm extended, and when his headlights fully illuminated her, he saw that her skin was the color of old parchment, and her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible portion, like looking into deep wells. Jake's foot hovered over the brake pedal, every rational part of his mind screaming at him to keep going, but his truck was already slowing, the air brakes hissing as he pulled onto the shoulder about 20 feet past where she stood. In his side mirror, he watched her lower her arm and begin walking toward his cab with measured, deliberate steps, her feet making no sound on the gravel shoulder. And he noticed that despite the wind whipping through the desert, her long coat never moved, hanging straight down like she was standing in a vacuum. When she reached his passenger door, she didn't knock or say anything, just stood there waiting, and Jake found himself reaching across the cab to unlock the door without understanding why, his hand moving of its own accord while his mind shouted protests he couldn't seem to voice. The door swung open with a metallic groan, and she climbed up into the cab with fluid, unnatural grace, settling into the passenger seat without a word, her black eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield. "Hot night," Jake managed to say, his voice cracking like he hadn't spoken in days, and when she turned to look at him, he felt something cold move through his chest despite the oppressive heat. "Getting hotter," she replied, and her voice sounded like wind blowing through a cemetery, hollow and echoing as if it was coming from somewhere very far away. Jake put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, glancing sideways at his passenger, who sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, that heavy coat somehow not showing a single bead of sweat despite the furnace-like temperature in the cab. "Where you headed?" he asked, trying to maintain some semblance of normal conversation while his mind reeled with the wrongness of the situation, the way she didn't seem to breathe or blink, the way the temperature in the cab seemed to be dropping despite the broken air conditioning. "Same place you are," she said without looking at him, and when he tried to ask what she meant, he found he couldn't speak, his throat closing up like invisible hands were squeezing his windpipe. The road ahead began to change, the asphalt becoming lighter in color, almost white, and the desert landscape was giving way to something else, terrain he didn't recognize with twisted trees that looked like they were made of bone, and hills that rose in geometric patterns too perfect to be natural. His speedometer showed he was doing 70, but it felt like they were barely moving, the mile markers crawling past in slow motion, and when he looked in his mirrors, he couldn't see any road behind them, just impenetrable darkness that seemed to follow the truck like a living thing. "You're not supposed to be here," the woman said suddenly, her voice now coming from multiple directions at once, and when Jake turned to look at her, she was gone, the passenger seat empty, except for a lingering smell of sulfur, and something else, something organic and rotting. But her voice continued, seeming to come from the dashboard, the seats, the very air around him. "This road doesn't go where you think it goes. This road goes down." The steering wheel began to feel slippery in his hands despite how tightly he was gripping it, and when he looked down he saw that his palms were bleeding, though he couldn't remember cutting them, dark red spreading across the plastic wheel and dripping onto his jeans. The white road stretched ahead endlessly, perfectly straight, with no curves or hills, just an infinite line cutting through a landscape that no longer looked like Earth, with a sky that had turned the color of dried blood and stars that pulsed like heartbeats. His fuel gauge still read 3/4 full, but now he understood that didn't matter, that he wasn't running on diesel anymore but on something else entirely, something that fed on fear and confusion, and the growing certainty that he would never see another human being again. The radio crackled to life, but instead of music or talk shows, it was broadcasting sounds he'd never heard before, chittering and clicking, and something that might have been screaming if screams could come from throats that weren't human, and underneath it all a rhythmic thumping that matched the pounding of his heart. When he tried to turn the radio off, the knob wouldn't move, and the sounds grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to be coming from inside his own skull. The road began to slope downward, gradually at first, then more steeply, and Jake realized he was descending into something, some vast hollow in the earth that his headlights couldn't penetrate, the darkness ahead so complete it seemed solid. His brakes wouldn't respond when he tried to slow down, the pedal going all the way to the floor with no resistance, and his engine was making sounds he'd never heard before, not the familiar rumble of diesel combustion, but something organic and wet, like a massive heart beating irregularly. The temperature gauge showed his engine was overheating, but instead of steam rising from the hood, there was smoke that glowed red in his headlights and smelled like burning flesh. The woman's voice returned, no longer coming from around him but from inside him, resonating in his bones. "Welcome to the night shift. Welcome to the road that never ends. Welcome to where all the lost drivers go." Jake tried to scream, but no sound came out, his voice stolen by the heat and the fear and the growing understanding that this wasn't a highway anymore, but something else entirely, something that wore the shape of a road to lure travelers into its depths. The last thing he saw before his headlights died was a sign beside the road, metal twisted and corroded but still readable. "Hell, next exit," and below that in smaller letters that seemed to writhe and change as he read them. "No return service." His truck kept rolling down into the darkness, engine silent now, carried by momentum and gravity towards something that waited in the depths below, something that had been patient for a very long time and was always hungry for new arrivals on the night shift that never ended. The diner sat at the intersection of two forgotten highways, like a neon island in an ocean of darkness, its pink and blue sign flickering Mel's 24-hour eats in letters that buzzed and sparked every few seconds, casting intermittent colored light across the empty parking lot, where heat mirages still danced despite the late hour. Sarah Chen had been driving for 14 hours straight, pushing her Honda through the Nevada desert on her way to a job interview in Reno that could change everything, her savings account down to double digits, and her apartment lease expiring in 6 days, making this cross-country drive less of a choice than a desperate gamble. The thermometer on her phone showed 119 degrees at 11:47 p.m., which seemed impossible but matched the way the asphalt radiated heat in visible waves, and her car's engine kept making alarming clicking sounds that grew worse with each mile. She'd passed the last town, if you could call it a town, 2 hours ago, just a cluster of abandoned buildings and rusted cars that looked like it had been evacuated decades earlier, and her GPS had been showing recalculating route for the past 50 miles, the blue line on her screen dissolving into question marks and error messages. The diner's parking lot was empty except for an old Peterbilt semi parked around back, and a motorcycle that looked like it hadn't been ridden in years, its chrome dulled with dust and its tires nearly flat. When Sarah killed her engine, the silence was absolute for about 3 seconds before the desert sounds crept in, not the friendly chirping of crickets but something else, a low thrumming that seemed to come from underground, punctuated by occasional sharp cracks like bones breaking. Her water bottles were empty, her phone showed no signal, and the needle on her fuel gauge was hovering just above empty, making the diner less of a choice than a necessity.
The glass doors were covered with posters and flyers that had been bleached white by the sun, their text illegible, and neon beer signs in the windows cast everything in shades of red and blue that made the shadows seem to move. A bell chimed when she pushed through the door, but it wasn't the cheerful ding of most restaurants. This was a deep, resonant toll that seemed to vibrate in her chest cavity and linger in the air longer than physics should have allowed. The interior was exactly what she'd expected from the outside. Cracked vinyl booths, a long counter with round stools, and that particular smell of old grease and disinfectant that every diner in America seemed to share. But there was something else underneath it, something organic and sweet that made her think of flowers left too long in a vase. The waitress behind the counter looked up when Sarah entered, a woman who might have been anywhere from 40 to 70, with bleached blonde hair piled high and makeup applied with a heavy hand that couldn't quite hide the deep lines around her eyes and mouth.
"Welcome to Mel's, honey," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent Sarah couldn't place, something vaguely southern but with odd inflections that made certain words sound foreign. "You look like you could use some coffee and a cool place to sit." The air conditioning was working overtime, dropping the temperature to what felt like Arctic levels after the furnace outside, and Sarah slid into a booth near the window where she could keep an eye on her car. The waitress, her name tag read Dolores in faded letters, brought over a glass of ice water without being asked, and Sarah drank it down in one long gulp, the cold liquid hitting her dehydrated system like a shock. "Rough night for driving," Dolores observed, refilling the glass from a pitcher that seemed to appear from nowhere. "Heat like this, it does things to people. Makes them see things that aren't there, hear voices in the wind." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet, her throat still raw from breathing superheated air for hours. The diner was completely empty except for the two of them, which seemed strange for a place that advertised 24-hour service, but maybe that was just how things were out here in the middle of nowhere. Through the window she could see her car sitting in the parking lot, heat still rising from its hood in visible waves, and beyond that the dark desert stretching to the horizon under a sky full of stars that seemed too bright, too close, like she was looking up at them through water. "You hungry, sweetheart?" Dolores asked, producing a laminated menu from her apron pocket. "We got the usual, burgers, fries, pie, everything's fresh." The menu was extensive, listing dozens of items in small print, but when Sarah tried to focus on the words they seemed to shift and blur, rearranging themselves into combinations that didn't make sense. Midnight meatloaf, desert rose soup, highway hash with extra miles. She blinked hard and looked again, but the text continued to swim before her eyes like it was written in a language she almost but didn't quite understand. "Just coffee," she managed to say, "and maybe directions. My GPS stopped working." Dolores smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes, which Sarah now noticed were an unusual shade of yellow like old amber. "GPS don't work so good out here. Too much interference from the mines." "Mines?" Sarah asked, but Dolores had already turned away, moving toward the coffee station with steps that seemed to glide rather than walk. Through the serving window that connected the dining area to the kitchen, Sarah could see movement, shadows that suggested someone was back there cooking, though she hadn't heard any sounds of food preparation. The coffee arrived in a heavy white mug, steam rising from its surface in patterns that looked almost like faces, and when Sarah lifted it to her lips, she found it was exactly the right temperature, not scalding hot but not lukewarm either, as if it had been prepared specifically for her preferred drinking temperature. The taste was rich and complex, with undertones she couldn't identify, something earthy and slightly metallic that lingered on her tongue. "You traveling alone?" Dolores asked, settling onto the stool across from Sarah's booth with the casual familiarity of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "That's not safe for a young woman, especially out here. Lots of things can happen in the desert. People disappear." Sarah's hand tightened around the coffee mug, the ceramic warm against her palms. "I'm just passing through, heading to Reno." "Reno," Dolores repeated, and something in her tone made it sound like she was talking about a place that didn't exist. "Long way from here. Very long way." The lights in the diner flickered, not the brief interruption of a power hiccup but a slow, deliberate dimming that lasted several seconds before returning to normal brightness. During those few seconds of semi-darkness, Sarah could have sworn she saw other people in the booths, a man in a suit, a family with children, an elderly couple, but when the lights came back up,
she and Dolores were alone again. "Storm coming," Dolores explained, though Sarah hadn't seen any clouds when she'd looked outside. "Always get electrical problems when a storm's coming." The coffee was affecting her strangely, making her feel simultaneously more alert and more drowsy, her thoughts sharp but her body heavy. She tried to check her phone, but the screen remained black no matter how many times she pressed the power button, and she realized she couldn't remember when she'd last seen it working. Had the battery died, or was it something else? "Your car's running hot," Dolores observed, looking out the window. "Saw the steam when you pulled up. You should let it cool down before you try to leave. Desert's hard on engines." Sarah looked outside and saw that her car was indeed smoking, white vapor rising from under the hood in steady plumes. She was certain it hadn't been doing that when she'd parked, but the heat could play tricks on metal, make problems worse quickly. "How long should I wait?" she asked. "Oh, couple hours at least, maybe longer. Heat like this, you push an engine too hard, it'll seize up on you. Then you'd really be stuck. The idea of spending hours in this place made Sarah's skin crawl, though she couldn't articulate why. There was nothing obviously wrong with the diner. It was clean, cool, and Dolores seemed friendly enough in her own odd way. But something felt off, like a photograph that had been slightly overexposed. All the details there, but somehow wrong. Is there a motel nearby? Sarah asked. Somewhere I could wait until morning? Dolores laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. Nearest motel's about 100 miles from here, honey. But don't you worry, Mel's is open all night and I don't mind the company. Gets lonely out here sometimes. Through the serving window, Sarah caught another glimpse of movement in the kitchen, and this time she was sure she saw someone, a large man in a stained apron, his face obscured by shadow, but his movements deliberate and focused. She wanted to ask who was back there, but something stopped her, an instinct that warned against drawing attention to what she'd seen. The coffee mug was empty, though she didn't remember drinking it all, and when Dolores refilled it without being asked, Sarah noticed that the waitress's hands were ice cold despite the heat outside, her skin almost blue under the fluorescent lights. You know, Dolores said conversationally, we get all kinds of travelers through here, people running from things, people looking for things, people who just got lost and can't find their way back. Desert has a way of calling to certain folks. Sarah's vision was starting to blur around the edges, the diner taking on a dreamlike quality where details shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. The vinyl booth seat felt like it was growing softer, more enveloping, and her limbs felt heavy as lead. What kind of things? She heard herself ask, though her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Oh, you know, debts, memories, people they used to be. Dolores's smile was getting wider, showing teeth that were too pointed and too numerous for a human mouth. Sometimes they find what they're looking for, sometimes what they're looking for finds them. The lights dimmed again, and this time they stayed dim, casting the diner in a reddish glow that made everything look like it was underwater. Sarah tried to stand up, but her legs wouldn't obey, her muscles refusing to respond to her commands. The coffee mug fell from nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor with a sound like breaking bells. Don't worry, honey, Dolores said, her voice now coming from multiple directions at once, echoing off the walls and ceiling. It's easier if you don't fight it. Everyone who comes to Mel's was already lost before they got here. We just help them find where they belong. Through the window, Sarah could see that her car was no longer in the parking lot, though she was certain it had been there moments before. The parking lot itself was different too, filled now with dozens of vehicles from different eras. Model T Fords, muscle cars from the 60s, modern SUVs, all of them covered with dust and looking like they'd been sitting there for years. The neon sign outside flickered and changed, the letters rearranging themselves to spell something else. Welcome to the last stop. As consciousness faded, Sarah could hear sounds coming from the kitchen, not cooking sounds but something else, something rhythmic and wet that might have been eating, and she understood with perfect clarity that she would never leave this place, that she had joined the ranks of the lost travelers who had found their way to Mel's 24-hour eats and discovered that some destinations were permanent. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Dolores removing her apron to reveal skin that wasn't skin at all, but something scaled and ancient, and eyes that held the depth of geological time, patient and hungry, and absolutely without mercy. The Sunshine Motel looked like it had been built sometime in the 50s and abandoned shortly after, its pastel yellow paint faded to the color of old bones, and its neon vacancy sign flickering erratically against the star-filled desert sky, casting intermittent red light across the cracked parking lot where weeds pushed through the asphalt in determined green clusters. Marcus Webb had been driving his motorcycle through California's Mojave Desert for 3 days straight, fleeing from a life that had imploded spectacularly in Los Angeles. Job lost, girlfriend gone, apartment foreclosed, with nothing but a backpack full of clothes and a tank full of gas between him and whatever came next. The temperature was still hovering around 115 degrees despite the late hour, the kind of dry heat that sucked moisture from your lungs and made every breath feel like inhaling sandpaper, and his bike had been running rough for the last 50 miles, the engine making sounds that suggested expensive problems he couldn't afford to fix. He'd been looking for a place to crash when he spotted the motel sign from the highway, a beacon of availability in a stretch of desert that seemed to go on forever in all directions, empty except for Joshua trees that stood like sentinels against the purple sky and the occasional small animal that scurried across the road in his headlight beam. The office was a small building attached to a row of identical rooms, each painted the same faded yellow and equipped with doors that had once been turquoise but now looked more like the color of old copper pennies. A handwritten sign in the window advertised clean rooms, cable TV, air conditioning, though the paper was so sun-bleached it was barely readable, and the parking lot contained only one other vehicle, an ancient Winnebago that looked like it hadn't moved in years, its tires flat and its windows covered with aluminum foil. Marcus killed his engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, letting the desert sounds wash over him, not the peaceful quiet he'd expected, but something more active, a low thrumming that seemed to come from underground, punctuated by sharp cracks and pops that might have been rocks cooling, or might have been something else entirely. The motel office was lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows and attracted a cloud of insects that buzzed and clicked against the glass, and through the window he could see an elderly man behind the counter, his head down as if he was reading or sleeping. The bell above the door was broken, hanging silent when Marcus pushed inside, but the old man looked up anyway, as if he'd been expecting this exact arrival at this exact time. He was thin to the point of gauntness, with skin like old leather and eyes that were either very dark brown or completely black. It was hard to tell in the dim light. "Need a room?" the man asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't place, something that might have been southern or might have been foreign. "Just for tonight," Marcus replied, pulling out his wallet and counting the crumpled bills inside. Barely enough for a room and gas to get to wherever he was going next. "Single bed, if you got it." The old man nodded and pushed a registration card across the counter, along with a pen that looked like it had been there since the motel opened. "Fill this out. $45 for the night. Checkouts at 11. The card was yellow with age and asked for information that seemed oddly detailed, not just name and address but next of kin, medical conditions, and a section titled Final Destination that Marcus assumed was meant to be humorous. He filled out what he could and left the rest blank, sliding the card back across the counter along with 2 20s and a 5. The old man studied the registration card with unusual intensity, his lips moving slightly as if he was reading it aloud to himself, then nodded and handed Marcus a key attached to a plastic fob shaped like a sun. "Room 7, he said, "down at the end. Ice machine's broken, but the air conditioning works fine. You might hear some noise from the other guests, but don't worry about it. They're mostly harmless." Marcus wanted to ask what he meant by mostly, but the old man had already turned away, shuffling toward a door marked private that probably led to his living quarters. The key felt unusually cold in Marcus's hand, the metal so chill it was almost painful to hold despite the ambient temperature, and when he looked at it closely, he could see that the number 7 had been scratched into the fob by hand rather than molded or stamped. Room 7 was at the far end of the row, its door painted the same faded turquoise as all the others, but somehow looking more weathered, the paint peeling in patches that revealed dark wood underneath. The key turned easily in the lock, but the door stuck for a moment before swinging open with a groan of protest, revealing an interior that looked exactly like what Marcus had expected from a cheap desert motel. Fake wood paneling, a bed covered with a spread that had probably been colorful once, a small television on a scratched dresser, and a window air conditioning unit that was already running despite the fact that he hadn't turned it on. The air inside was cold enough to make him shiver after the oppressive heat outside, and it carried a smell he couldn't identify, something medicinal and sweet that reminded him of hospitals or funeral homes. He dropped his backpack on the bed and went to check the bathroom, flipping the light switch and squinting in the sudden glare of fluorescent tubes that flickered and hummed before settling into steady illumination. The bathroom was basic but clean, white tile that looked recently scrubbed, and a mirror that reflected his travel-worn appearance with unflattering accuracy. 3 days of stubble, hair flattened by his helmet, eyes bloodshot from sun and wind and lack of sleep. When he turned on the tap, the water ran rust-colored for several seconds before clearing, and when he cupped his hands to drink, it tasted metallic and slightly warm despite the cold air in the room. Back in the main room, Marcus tried the television, but all he got was static on every channel, white noise that seemed unusually loud in the enclosed space. The remote control was cracked, and several buttons were missing, but even when he tried to change channels manually using the buttons on the set itself, nothing happened. Just endless static that began to form patterns if he watched it long enough, swirling shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving back into random dots and lines. He was exhausted, but something about the room made him reluctant to get undressed or lie down on the bed, an instinct that warned him to stay alert even though he couldn't identify any specific threat. The air conditioning continued to run, maintaining a temperature that felt like it was somewhere in the 50s, cold enough that his breath was beginning to show in small puffs of vapor. Through the thin walls he could hear sounds from the other rooms, not talking or television, but something else. A rhythmic tapping that might have been someone typing, or might have been something more organic, and underneath that, a low humming that seemed to vibrate in his bones. He tried to peer through the curtains to see if there were lights on in the other rooms, but the fabric was thick and dark, blocking his view of the parking lot. When he pressed his ear to the wall, the sounds became clearer, definitely tapping, but in no pattern he could recognize, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes stopping altogether before starting up again. The room seemed to be getting colder, and when he checked the air conditioning unit, he found that the temperature control was set to its highest setting, but the air coming out of the vents was still frigid, carrying that strange sweet smell that was getting stronger with each passing minute. His watch showed 2:17 a.m., but he felt wide awake, his nerves jangling with an energy that might have been caffeine withdrawal, or might have been something else entirely. That's when he heard the footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, like someone walking the length of the motel and back again, pausing at each door for several seconds before moving on. Marcus crept to the window and tried to look through a gap in the curtains, but all he could see was darkness and the faint red glow of the vacancy sign. The footsteps stopped outside his door, and he held his breath, waiting for a knock that never came, just silence that stretched on until he began to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing. Then the door handle began to turn, slowly and quietly, and Marcus realized he'd forgotten to use the chain lock, that anyone with a key could walk right in. He lunged for the door just as it began to open, throwing his weight against it and fumbling for the chain, but the resistance on the other side was enormous, like something much stronger than a human was pushing back. Through the crack he could see part of a face, pale skin and one eye that reflected the light like an animal's, and when the thing on the other side spoke, its voice was the old man from the office but somehow wrong, distorted as if it was coming through water. "Just checking to make sure you're comfortable," it said, still pushing against the door with inhuman strength. "Some guests have trouble sleeping their first night. The altitude, you know, takes some getting used to." Marcus threw all his weight against the door, finally managing to get the chain engaged, and immediately the pressure stopped, leaving him gasping and shaking. "I'm fine," he called through the door, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just tired." "Of course you are," the voice replied, but it was moving away now, the footsteps resuming their slow patrol of the motel. "Sleep well. Checkout's at 11, but most of our guests find they want to extend their stay. The desert grows on you after a while." Marcus spent the rest of the night sitting in the chair by the window, fully dressed and ready to run, listening to the sounds that came and went through the thin walls, sometimes the tapping, sometimes what sounded like machinery running, sometimes voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. As dawn approached, the air conditioning finally stopped, and the temperature in the room began to rise toward something approaching normal, but the sweet smell lingered, getting stronger as the air warmed up. When pale light began to filter through the curtains, he risked another look outside and saw that the parking lot was no longer empty. There were dozens of vehicles now, cars and trucks and motorcycles from different eras, all of them covered with dust and looking like they'd been sitting there for years. His own bike was still where he'd left it, but it looked different somehow, smaller and more weathered, as if time had accelerated around it during the night. The registration office was dark, its windows reflecting the morning sun like dead eyes, and when Marcus tried his room key in the door, it wouldn't turn. The lock mechanism seized as if it had rusted solid overnight. He pounded on the door and called for the old man, but there was no response, just the echo of his voice bouncing off the empty buildings and the sound of wind moving through the Joshua trees. His motorcycle started on the first try, but the engine sounded different, older somehow, and when he checked the odometer, it showed thousands more miles than it had the night before, as if it had been driven extensively while he slept. The highway stretched ahead of him, empty and shimmering with heat mirages, but when he looked in his mirrors, he could see the Sunshine Motel receding into the distance, its yellow walls and turquoise doors looking exactly as they had when he'd arrived, waiting patiently for the next traveler who needed a place to spend the night in the desert where time moved differently and checkout was more of a suggestion than a requirement.